Story number 1. I remember one of the scariest things that ever happened to me was when I was in an airport when I was around 8 years old. I practically lived in airports up until the year I turned 15. At that point, my parents decided that I needed a little bit of stability in my life, especially when it came to education. Before that, though, we traveled a lot. This was because of their jobs as news journalists for a pretty big newspaper at the time. By the time this story took place, my parents basically let me walk around the airports all by myself. I knew my way around. I usually only walked off alone if I needed to use the bathroom or if I was thirsty and wanted some water. One day, I wandered off to get something to drink without letting my parents know. I found a water cooler, but all the cups were gone. A man spotted me, I think he was the janitor, and he told me that they were currently restocking the cups. I leaned against the wall beside the water cooler and waited. It wasn't long before I noticed that some guy was watching me. He wasn't just looking over at me, he was blatantly staring at me. My eyes accidentally met his, and his emotionless face instantly changed as his lips curled into a wide, sickly smile. I felt uncomfortable straight away. I stayed by the water cooler and did my best to avoid eye contact with him. That was a mistake. During the time I was trying not to look at him, he got up from his seat, walked over to me, and leaned against the wall beside me. I practically jumped out of my skin. He had the same sickly smile on his face as he looked down at me. He started flirting with me. I was trying to be friendly, but somehow he mistook that as me flirting back. That was when he started saying a lot of inappropriate things. Now that I'm older, it wouldn't really shock me if someone started talking to me like that. Back then, when I was only 8, I almost threw up because of the things he was saying. That was when I told him that I needed to go. His mood changed instantly. As I pushed off the wall to walk away, he threw his arm in front of me. He pressed his hand against my chest and practically slammed my back into the wall. Then he stepped in front of me, put both his hands against the wall right beside my head, and leaned in close to me. His eyes were wide with fury, and his lips were twisted into a scowl. He leaned in so close that our noses were practically touching. He kept saying things like how he didn't give me permission to leave, or telling me how he owns me. I was terrified. I'm pretty sure I was shaking, and I actually felt physically ill. I didn't know how I was going to get out of that situation. I wanted to run and scream, but he had me cornered. To this day, I'm forever grateful to the guy that showed up to refill the plastic cups. The guy moved away from me when the man with the plastic cups started questioning what was going on. As soon as I saw my chance, I ran. I ran straight back to my parents. I didn't tell them what happened. I knew they would make a scene and that I would have my wandering privileges taken away from me. As upset as I was, I pushed it out of my mind. I never forgot about it though. That moment has stuck with me, and I am extra cautious whenever I go anywhere alone, even to this day. Story number 2. I hate flying. I have a huge fear of heights, and I've read way too many statistics about plane crashes, drunk pilots, and how likely survival from either of these is. Basically, I avoid planes as often as I can. I drive if at all possible, and if not possible, I go on a boat. Yes, there are just as many dangers in cars or on boats, but I can swim, and I'm a good driver. There's something about putting your life in someone else's hands. You just sit back while someone else flies you through the air. It's just not for me. I guess all of this means nothing when it comes to this story. I did end up boarding a plane. I guarantee it was completely unavoidable. Anyway, my very first flight only solidified my utter hatred and fear of flying. We were about halfway through the flight and in the middle of the ocean. I had no idea where exactly. I had gone through at least 5 of those tiny alcohol bottles. The hostess could tell I was nervous as hell, so she just kept bringing more. At some point, we heard the pilot's voice over the intercom. It was hard to understand him. He was slurring his words and it sounded like he was crying. I heard the word sorry over and over again, but I wasn't sure what he was sorry for. This is probably because of how tipsy I was, because whatever he said had the rest of the plane in a panic. The air hostess rushed to the front and started pounding on the door leading to the pilot. A few of the passengers got up to help them, but they couldn't get it open. I had no idea what was going on at this point. As I looked around, the passengers in their seats were either bursting into tears or screaming their heads off. I sobered up real quick. I tried to ask the person next to me what was happening, but they were too busy crying. That's when the plane suddenly tipped forward. I felt the seatbelt dig into my stomach. Everyone who wasn't seated flung down the aisle. The plane was headed straight down. I had the window seat, so I could see that we were headed straight for the ocean below us. The speed at which we were descending had my life flashing before my eyes. I still had no idea what was going on. In that moment, I knew that I was going to die. Then the plane began leveling out. We didn't crash. We started rising again, and the door to the pilot finally opened. The air hostess and some passengers rushed in. Later, they came out with the pilot. He had a black eye, and his hands were tied behind his back with what looked like a phone charger. It wasn't until we landed at the nearest airport that I finally found out what had happened. The pilot had a breakdown on the plane. He'd recently divorced his wife of 7 years and lost custody of the children. No one knew it since he looked so calm and collected on the outside, but he was only seconds away from snapping. He snapped while piloting that plane. He went onto the intercom to tell everyone how sorry he was, but that he just couldn't take it anymore. He was going to nosedive that plane into the ocean, no matter how many of us he took with him. Thankfully, the co-pilot managed to overpower him and set the plane right. Believe me when I say, I am never getting on another plane. Story number 3. I work at an airport. It's not one of those great jobs, like a pilot or an air hostess. I don't get to go on the plane and travel. I just stay at the airport. I have the privilege of packing the planes. Now, I don't handle your luggage. I work mostly with cargo planes. So, I'll be dealing with the large crates filled with supplies for stores and that. I usually don't have to deal with anything that hectic. During my one night shift, I was operating the forklift. I moved all the large crates and boxes to the plane first. We like to position the larger cargo first so it's easier to pack the smaller crates around them. After I finished that, one of my coworkers came running up to me. He was really excited about something and begged me to follow him back to the cargo hold. I parked the forklift and followed him. There were a few more crates that needed packing. He led me straight past that pile and to the pile that was meant to be loaded on the next plane. I was confused and I was thinking this was all a prank. I half expected someone to jump out at me. We rounded the large pile and lying on the floor behind it was a coffin. I've heard my coworkers talking about this before. Someone might die while on vacation and their family has their body transported back. Packing a coffin in with the cargo isn't unheard of, but I've never done it before. I'll admit it freaked me out. I've never really been around any dead bodies before. I'm pretty young and everyone I know is still alive. I've never even been to a funeral. Something about knowing that there's a dead body in that coffin just sends shivers up and down my whole body. I did my best to avoid it during my shift, and I even asked my coworker if I could just skip packing the next plane. He agreed since he saw how freaked out I was. I decided to take the hour for my break. It was a small cargo plane, so I figured they'd be done packing once the hour was up. I was sitting in the break room, enjoying a coffee and the last stale bagel from the morning run, when I heard screaming outside. I rushed out of that break room so fast that I barely knew what was going on. I didn't know why anyone would be screaming or what could be happening. I got out into the cargo hold to find my coworker on the floor behind the coffin. He was just staring at it. His eyes were wide and filled with terror. When I asked what was wrong, he simply raised a shaky hand and pointed at the coffin. The moment his finger pointed at the coffin, as if he'd used some kind of spell on it, there was a knock on the wood. We both let out a yelp. I jumped back and my coworker scrambled to his feet. He ran around the coffin and threw himself behind me. I was both frightened, but also curious. It wasn't until the next sound that came out of the coffin for me to actually act on my curiosity. "Help me," were the words we both heard yelled out in the softest, most childlike voice. Now, this wasn't a child coffin. It was fully sized for an adult. I couldn't fathom why a child's voice would be coming from an adult's coffin. I had a suspicion, so I walked forward and threw the coffin open. The suspicions were correct. There was a child lying inside the coffin on top of the dead body. I heard stories about children smuggling themselves across borders in the cargo holds of airplanes. I never suspected that one of them would hide inside a coffin of all things. That's what happened. My coworker and I felt very silly for thinking it was the dead body inside knocking on the wood, but it was just the child calling for help quickly after he realized he was running out of air. Story number 4. I bet you've never seen or even heard of an abandoned airport before. Airports are rarely empty. They operate 24/7, and there are always crowds of people lining up to board the next flight. Let me tell you, there's something so strange and surreal about seeing an airport completely empty. I explore abandoned buildings for a living. I take artsy photos, write a short story about the place, and post it all on my blog. You'd be surprised how many people will pay to own photos like those, especially when the building is condemned and about to be torn down. Those photos instantly become one of a kind. I've encountered some weird things during my explorations, but nothing was ever as creepy as this abandoned airport. I rocked up early in the morning while the sun was still rising. The golden hour is what we photographers like to call it. I took some clean shots of the outside and started exploring inside. This wasn't an international airport, so it was kind of small, but it still took me all day to work my way through the interior. I'd been through the building the previous day with a guide, so he could show me all the dangerous spots that I should avoid. However, when I go in to take my shots, I like to be the only one in the building. This really heightens the feeling of abandonment. That day, unlike many days I've had, I didn't feel alone. That feeling you have when you think you hear an echo of footsteps behind you, but you turn around and no one is there. You're sure you can feel someone watching you. There are eyes in every dark corner, and your mind starts playing tricks on you. I had that feeling the whole time I was there. I didn't let it distract me from my job. I took the photos as quickly as I could, and I rushed out of there. That night, I was going through the photos I'd taken on my laptop and writing up my blog about the airport. I was 3 coffees in and hyper-focused by the time I noticed it. In the background of one of the photos, I could clearly see the silhouette of a man standing in the shadows. The sight of him sent chills up and down my spine. I scanned through the rest of the photos, this time keeping an eye out for the man. He was in every single photo, just hiding in the shadows. The worst part was, he was looking right at the camera. He was looking right at me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt sick. The fact that he was in every single photo that I took just let me know that he was following me around the whole day. He could have done anything to me, and honestly, that thought is scarier than what actually happened. Story number 5. I once got lost in an airport. I haven't been in airports a lot since my family doesn't travel. One summer, my parents decided to treat us to a short trip to Alaska. We were more of a winter family. My older brother and I play ice hockey, and my mother is a figure skater. So, summer isn't exactly our time of year. I was around 12 at the time, not really young, but also not old enough to make any good decisions. On the day of the flight, we arrived early and had to wait a long time before our flight started boarding. About an hour in, I really needed to use the bathroom. I got up and went off in search for one. Like I said, I was a 12-year-old boy, so my parents didn't really worry about letting me walk around by myself. Anyway, I got lost. I had no idea which way to go, and I didn't know how to read the airport signs. I think the more I tried to find my way back, the more I got lost. I had wandered into a more quiet part of the airport. There weren't a lot of people there, and the only interaction I had was with a janitor after I asked him how I could find my way back to my boarding gate. He gave me directions, and I started back that way. On my way back, I heard someone calling for me. "Hey, kid." It was a raspy whisper coming from around the corner beside me. I turned to see a man sticking his head around the corner and smiling at me. His eyes were darting around. At the time, I thought he was just being weird. It's only now that I'm older that I realize he was really trying not to be seen. I turned to him and he beckoned for me to come closer. He said he was lost and wanted me to help him find a way out. I was lost too, but the janitor gave me directions back to my parents. I told the guy that, and he freaked out. He said he wanted my help only, and no one else's. This was when I got my first red flag. He just kept telling me to follow him and beckoning me around the corner. I leaned to the side and peeked down the corner behind him. It was dark and empty. If I went there then, no one would be able to see us. I didn't know why at the time, but something about the guy gave me the creeps. I shook my head and insisted that we go find my parents and ask for help. That's when the guy got angry. He started yelling and cursing. I didn't want to deal with it anymore, so I ran away. I followed the janitor's instructions and found my way back to my parents. The man didn't follow me, and I didn't bother telling my parents about him. Now that I'm older, I realize that I probably should have told them. That man was planning on doing something to me. I'm just glad I had the good sense to get out of there, but other kids might have been more naive.